What is free will, and how does it relate to reason? When I think of the reason that I chose something, does that mean the reason caused my choice or not? How does free will relate to causation? Let's ask Thomas Aquinas. Let's talk about Thomas Aquinas' views on free will. First, as a background, we will discuss his anatomy of mind, kind of map out the different powers and abilities of the mind. This lays a backdrop for his discussion on free will. This is taken from the Summa Theologica, various passages. There's three major powers, or abilities, or souls, or faculties. These are different names for the same thing. When you see soul here, don't think of soul as what you usually imagine as a sort of ghost inhabiting your body, which is you. But this is from the Latin word anima, which means principle of life. So this is a principle of life. Ignore the word soul and think about the Latin word anima, or principle of life. It is the word from which we get animal. Animal, with an L on the end, is a thing which has this principle of life. But there's other kinds of principles of life. The most foundational is the vegetative power. Humans, animals, and plants all share this power. This is simply the power of life, which is constituted in reproduction, growth, and nutrition, which is to say homeostasis, or the stability of our bodies maintaining health. Next up, the next higher power is the sensitive power, which is shared with humans and animals only. This is having an animal type body and is expressed through having five senses and emotion, which is also often called passion. And then the thing that only humans have is the intellectual power, which is higher rationality or free will. This is not to say animals cannot think. Certainly animals have thoughts. We see animals have dreams, or at least they kick and fidget or bark in their while they're sleeping, and so we can postulate that they have dreams. However, they cannot engage in reasoning, in the formulation of arguments, and in higher reasoning skills, whatever the reason may be in your worldview. But for Aquinas, this is the basic anatomy of a person in terms of three powers. Now, it is common for some students to reject this distinction based on a sort of a simplified view of evolution. Now, however we want to explain this difference, whether it's a leap in evolution, or God made it this way, or some other reason, it has become evident by scientists that there is some kind of important distinction here. Multiple experiments have been done, and there are certain capabilities that humans have that animals do not in terms of higher thinking. So animals may dream, and so because they dream, we know that they can have images in their mind. And of course, we know that animals can learn. Some of them can even learn sign language, like apes can learn sign language. But at the end of the day, it is all stimulus response, right? So humans can use language with infinite versatility and creativity, where at any given moment, you can say a sentence that has never been said before in the history of the universe. In fact, that happens rather frequently. Animals cannot. Animals cannot form propositions. They cannot execute the three acts of the mind, which we are about to go over. They do not understand concepts as being universals. They do not understand, for example, triangle in the sense of being able to define it as a three-sided plane figure. they cannot form propositions that can be true or false. And because of some of these things, and because they do not have free will, and that their sort of limited judgment is simply a stimulus response, it is because of that that we do not say that animals are moral creatures. Animals are not moral creatures. When an animal does something, we do not say that it was moral or immoral to do it. Even when we are faced with, let's say, a dog who makes a mess on the kitchen floor, the dog did not do anything morally wrong. The dog did something that's very natural to dogs, and it may be inconvenient for us, and we may tell the dog that it's wrong, but it's not morally wrong. The dog is not guilty, morally guilty, because the dog has no rationality. The dog has no free will. It is simply stimulus response, and because it's stimulus response, you can teach the dog to be house trained. You can teach the dog to behave in certain ways because it knows the difference between fear and pleasure and what to do to get those things. That is different than rationality. We will look at the three acts of the mind which are unique to humans. Let's look closer at reason, or the intellectual power. The intellectual power is divided up into two sub-powers, you might say, which is the cognitive power and the intellectual appetitive power. The cognitive power is to say thinking. The intellectual appetitive power is to say desire, namely in terms of the will, not just base emotions, because even animals have base emotions, but this is the will. The cognitive power has three acts of the mind. The first act of the mind is simple apprehension, which is where we have understanding of what a single concept or term is by definition. So you think of, say, unicorn, and you can define unicorn. You have a concept of unicorn in your mind. This is just one word. But at this point, we have not even said whether or not this thing exists. That's where the second act of the mind comes in, a judgment, judging. We can act in judging, which combines terms or words into a proposition or a sentence that makes a truth claim. So now instead of just having unicorn, now we have the unicorn exists. The statement, the unicorn exists. This can be true or false. Now at this point, we are correlating our idea to reality and truth becomes possible. So judgment makes a claim about truth. What is true? The third act of the mind takes those propositions and combines them into an argument. So the first act of the mind, we just get words, individual words. The second act, we get sentences or propositions that make truth claims. And then the third one is where we take propositions and we go somewhere with it. We combine them in different ways to learn something new, to have an argument that terminates in a new conclusion. There's different types of reasoning. There's deductive reasoning and there's inductive reasoning. But these are the three acts of the mind, of the cognitive power, in pursuit of truth. The cognitive power seeks truth as its object. And then we have the intellectual appetitive power, which is, according to Aquinas, so this bottom row here, simple apprehension, judgment, reason, will, and then one more that is to come, these are actions. These are not powers. These are different actions that the abilities can give. So the first act of the will is to desire the ultimate end of happiness. Aquinas is going to say that we don't choose this, we just all have this. All humans have this in virtue of being human. And then there's the act of free will, which is choosing means to the ultimate end. So how do we choose to pursue happiness, right? And of course, because ethics is possible, some of those choices can be good and some of them can be bad. Now let's talk about Aquinas on free will. It'd be important for you also to look at my lecture on Aquinas' happiness and virtue, his discussion of happiness and virtue, to flesh out some of these ideas even more. But this is background to that, you might say. Okay, let's keep this sort of mental map up here as point of reference as we start to ask his questions. All right, so Aquinas asks whether the will desires something of necessity. Is there something that we all desire, every person, and you can't escape it? He says, first of all, necessity means many things. It could mean coercion, because coercion works against the will as an external force that applies violence to the will. Another necessity is internal, as the thing must act according to its nature. So coercion is when something else outside of you forces you to do something. But then there's internal necessity, where something acts in a way because it's its nature to do so. So it is necessarily the case that a seed is going to grow into a plant. It's just part of its nature. But if someone comes and chops down the plant, let's say chops down the tree, that's coercion. The tree had to fall because someone chopped it down. In this way, the will is necessarily ordered to the ultimate end of happiness, which is to say that human nature is necessarily ordered to desire happiness. Now, he asks further whether the will desires of necessity whatever it desires. In other words, does it desire everything through necessity? He says the will can tend to nothing except under the aspect of the good, which is the ultimate end. But because good is of many kinds, for this reason the will is not of necessity determined to one. And then he postulates a possible objection. It would seem that the will desires all things of necessity. Evil is outside the scope of the will, for example. Therefore, the will tends of necessity to the good which is proposed to it. All right? So sometimes this objection says, sometimes you can choose good, and sometimes you can choose evil. His reply is that the will can tend to nothing except under the aspect of good. But because good is of many kinds, for this reason the will is not of necessity determined to one. So this is to say that we necessarily desire what we think is good, but since we have the freedom to choose different means to that end, that means that anytime you choose something, you think that it is good for you in some way. It is good for you. It satisfies some desire that you have. It satisfies something in you. So you think of it as good for you. Even if you know that it's not morally good, in that moment when you choose, you think that you are choosing something good for you, that to satisfy the desire, good in some respect. Nobody chooses evil just for the sake of evil. Even if somebody knows that what they're doing is evil, they want it. They want it because they think, at worst, they think, well, this might be evil, but it is still going to satisfy something in me. It's still a good for me. Good in the most abstract sense, not of necessarily being a moral good, but just being a satisfaction of a desire that I have. This is similar to Augustine's view on evil as privation. All right, so free will is the ability to choose different kinds of goods, but we all ultimately seek happiness, which is a good for human nature. Now he asks whether the will moves the intellect. All right, we have two major powers here. We have the cognitive power and the intellectual appetitive power. That intellectual appetitive power is often just called the will, right? Because it is the seat of desire. So he is asking whether it moves the intellect. Which one of these two powers is in control here? Which one is more important? Which one moves the other one? He says a thing can move another in two ways. As the efficient cause, or the agent, the thing that sort of pushes behind in causing. He says the will, as agent, moves all the powers of the soul to their respective acts, except the natural powers of the vegetative part, which are not subject to our will, which is just to say that we can't choose whether or not our heart beats or whether or not blood circulates through our veins. So efficient cause, if you recall Aristotle's four causes, which are material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. The efficient cause is the agent of change or stability. All right? Material cause is the thing something is made out of. Formal cause answers the question, what is it, for the essential and accidental attributes. And then the final cause is the purpose or end goal. So in terms of efficient causality, the will moves thinking. But in terms of final causality, the end moves the agent. The intellect moves the will in one sense, and the will moves the intellect in another, as we have said above. So they move each other in different respects. And we will look at that dynamic in a little bit more detail as we progress. Right? So, does thinking cause the will to choose, or does the will cause thinking to happen? Now let's ask whether man has free will. He says yes, otherwise we would have no moral responsibility. He says counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would be in vain. This contrasts two things. He says some things act without judgment, as a stone moves downwards, and in like manner all things which lack knowledge. And some act from judgment, but not a free judgment, as the brute animals. Right? So in the first case we have plants or just objects, inanimate objects. And then next we have animals, which act from some kind of judgment, but not a free judgment, as brute animals. For the sheep, seeing the wolf, judges it a thing to be shunned, from a natural and not from a free judgment, because it judges not from reason, but from natural instinct. So when a sheep is afraid of a wolf, it is simply stimulus response. And that can be learned and changed through learning, but it is not reason. A sheep does not think about the fact that he was scared, and a sheep does not think about thinking about being scared. So here we are in this whole video. We are thinking about thinking. There's no way that any animal does that. That is a higher act of reason that animals do not do. Animal thoughts are stimulus response, according to Aquinas. Now, Aquinas says this judgment of humans in the case of some particular act is not from a natural instinct, like in animals, stimulus response, but from some act of comparison in reason, which is to say, humans may have instincts, but sometimes we have two instincts that conflict, and our reason is the ability to choose between them and to choose to ignore instincts. Sometimes the moral thing to do is to ignore the instinct and do what's right anyway, right? like self-preservation. Sometimes we have to put ourselves in harm's way to help someone else. Therefore, he acts from free judgment and retains the power of being inclined to various things. For reason in contingent matters may follow opposite courses, as we see in dialectic syllogism and rhetorical arguments. Now, particular operations are contingent, and therefore in such matters the judgment of reason may follow opposite courses, and is not determinate to one. And forasmuch as man is rational, it is necessary that man have free will. I want to draw your attention to a couple of these last two lines that are highlighted here. It says, forasmuch as man is rational, it is necessary that man have free will, which is just to say that since humanity has rationality, it also has free will and therefore moral responsibility, whereas animals do not have rationality or free will or moral responsibility. And then this other line here, the judgment of reason may follow opposite courses and is not determinate to one. That is to say that freedom is primarily defined in terms of being not necessary. All right, free will is a necessary aspect of human nature, but also free will is the ability to choose otherwise. All right, so I could choose A or I could choose B, and it's up to my free will to choose them. It's not up to just instinct or stimulus response. This is called the principle of alternate possibilities, or PAP, and we will look at this in more detail in a moment. So one possible objection to this statement that Aquinas made is that the Bible says man doesn't have free will. His reply is that those words of the apostle are not to be taken as though man does not wish or does not run of his free will. In fact, the Bible affirms free will, but because the free will is not sufficient thereto unless it be moved and helped by God. So in some way, the free will is helped by God, at least on certain occasions, or maybe on every occasion. Somehow it is moved by God. So the free will can be influenced or moved by God in some way. Note, free will is moved by God somehow and still remains free. That's an important notice, that somehow those two ideas are compatible, that we are free and yet the free will is moved by God somehow. This is to ask, is Aquinas compatibilist or libertarian? Just bookmark that idea in your mind because we're going to come back to it here in a moment. Is Aquinas compatibilist or libertarian? Compatibilism says that determinism from God is compatible with free will. Determinism is to say that everything is governed by cause and effect and order. Libertarianism says the will is its own ultimate cause and may act contrary to influences, or contra-causal, in determinism. Let's look at these in more detail in a moment. All right, objection 3 says, if God moves the will, man has no free will. His reply is, free will is the cause of its own movement. All right, so now this sounds libertarian a little bit, because by his free will, man moves himself to act, but it does not of necessity belong to liberty that what is free should be the first cause of itself. So this freedom might be compatible with some cause that is prior to free will, right? Maybe free will is not the first cause of its own movement. He says free will He says that it does not of necessity belong to liberty that what is free should be the first cause of itself, as neither for one thing to be cause of another need it to be the first cause. In other words, God therefore is the first cause, as we see maybe in Aristotle. If everything is cause and effect, there has to be a first cause, and he's the first cause who moves and causes both natural and voluntary. All right, so in some way, God is the origin of all things, because God created us, according to Aquinas. And just as by moving natural causes he does not prevent their acts being natural, so by moving voluntary causes he does not deprive their actions of being voluntary. So this natural causation is to say that it's not a miracle that a seed grows into a tree. It's not a miracle that a child grows into an adult. That's just natural causation. However, who set those things originally in motion, right? Who created plants and who created people? Well, God did, and God can work through those causes, even though they are natural to the things themselves. In the same way, free will. Free will is natural to humans, but that does not mean that God does not cause them and cause the choices in some way, but rather, he is the cause of this very thing in them, for he operates in each thing according to its own nature. All right? So this is to say that if you think back to the two forms of necessity, one is coercion, which is saying that an external force acts on something in a way that is against its own nature. So somebody takes an axe and chops the tree down. Okay, that's coercion. And then there's necessity of internal operation. A thing must in some way act according to its nature. And since it's according to our nature to have free will is a necessary aspect of human nature. And this last line here says, he operates in each thing according to its own nature. So that when God operates in us, it does not violate our free will, but it is along our free will, or with our free will, or through our free will. Note, God causes both natural and voluntary. Something can be caused and yet voluntary. This sounds like compatibilism. So it's still difficult to interpret Aquinas here, whether he is compatibilist or libertarian. But it could seem more like he is compatibilist. All right? God operates in each thing according to its own nature. Determinism works through nature and free will, not against it. All right? So in determinism, we cannot be angry at feeling like the universe is forcing us to do what we do not want to do. Right? So we can't be angry at determinism because determinism works through our desires. So that means that anything that we desire is part of the cause and effect in determinism. That means that if we did not want something to happen, it wasn't because we are fighting against determinism. We're fighting against regular cause and effect and natural cause and effect. Something may happen and we did not want it to, but that's not because of some sort of magical fate. Fate is different than determinism because it works despite freedom. So you can be angry at fate. You can see that fate is sort of coercing you to do things that you do not want to do. Right? So fate is not being affirmed by Aquinas. Or if you watch my video on Augustine, fate is not affirmed by Augustine either. Fate is an impersonal power that is tends to be characterized as being coercive. It's an external causation, whereas determinism works through nature. It works through internal causation. In other words, you can be angry at fate for coercing you to do something you don't want, but determinism works through your desires, such that whatever you choose happens, and this happens according to causality, not contrary to causality. He asks whether free will is a power. He defines free will as the act of the intellectual appetitive power, which is desire, in choosing various means to the ultimate end. All right, we've mentioned this already briefly. It is not a habit, right? It's an action. All right, free will is an action. It's not a habit. It's not a power. A power is an ability to act. So free will is the actual action, and it's not a habit. Free will is not a habit because a habit comes from repetition of choices. So this action leads to habits. It is prior to habits, but it is not a habit itself. Right? Which would mean that free will is something we gain rather than something we are born with, right? Because habit is something that we gain. But free will is not something that we gain. Free will is something that we have from birth. A habit in relation to free will is when repeated free choices cultivate a disposition to act in the same way in the same circumstances, right? Virtue is one type of habit, for example. For the will, habit will be called a moral virtue, a good habit, or a vice, a bad habit, right? For the intellect, it's an intellectual virtue. You can look up my video on Aquinas on happiness and virtue for more information on different types of virtue and how they relate to habits and the powers of the mind. All right, through habit, the intellectual appetitive power, the will, uses reason to lead emotions, rather than emotions ruling the intellect. Okay, this is another comment of ethics where if there are three major powers, the intellect, the sensitive power, which animals have, and the vegetative power, those three powers, then the proper way to function as a human rather than as an animal is that reason will lead the emotions. Emotions are still an essential core part of who we are, but the intellect will lead them so that when we act according to wisdom rather than folly, rather than foolish, whimsical, emotional overreactions. Now our emotional reactions will be governed by reason so that we do it in appropriate ways at appropriate times. All right, he asks whether free will is an appetitive power, whether will is a power distinct from, whether free will is a power distinct from the will. All right, so this is to distinguish free will. What are we talking about with free will, specifically free will? All right, the quick conclusion is since good as such is the object of the appetite, all right, so the intellectual appetitive power seeks good, seeks the goodness of the whole person, and the cognitive power seeks the truth. So truth is cognitive power, goodness is an intellectual appetitive power, all right? Since good as such is the object of the appetite, it follows that choice is principally an act of the appetitive power, and thus free will is an appetitive power, right? So free will is an action from the appetitive power. Free will is nothing else than the will, okay? When we see will in this context, not free will, but just will, he's referring to the overall intellectual appetitive power, all right? Yes, so free will is an action from the will. On the part of the intellectual apprehension, which is cognitive power, we have intellect, simple apprehension, and reason. So on the part of the intellectual, so that's two acts of the mind, right? That's the first and third act of the mind. So on the part of the intellectual appetite, in a sort of corollary kind of way, we have will to the ultimate end. All right, that's on the far right there with the map symbol. We will the ultimate end. And we have free will of means, which is nothing else but the power of choice. So when we talk about choice, we're talking about free will here on the left, rather than willing ultimate ends. And both of these are actions of the intellectual appetitive power, which is sometimes just called desire, or that is also sometimes just called will. The intellectual appetite is the mind's desire. It must desire the ultimate end of happiness, and it is free to desire various means to that end. Right? This is distinguishing will and free will. Let's back up and look at the mechanics of choice. He says the proper act of free will is choice. For we say that we have a free will because we can take one thing while refusing another, and this is to choose. Therefore, we must consider the nature of free will by considering the nature of choice. Now, two things concur in choice. One on the part of the cognitive power, and the other on the part of the appetitive power. All right, so now we're not just looking at the anatomy of the mind in this sort of mental map, but let's look at the anatomy of a choice. All right, so a choice has two things that concur in a choice. Two things are in operation: the cognitive power and the appetitive power. But specifically, which parts? All right, on the part of the cognitive power, counsel is required by which we judge, all right, one thing to be preferred to another. So judgment is that second act of the mind in the middle there. Second act of the mind is a judgment which makes a proposition which says this part, you have two choices in front of you. You have option A and you have option B. And it is your reason, your act of judgment in your mind that judges A is truly better for me than B. A, it is true that A will satisfy my desire for what I think is good for me. So judgment makes that claim. Judgment claims it is true that this option is better for me, better for fulfilling my desire than the other option, right? That is an act of judgment. That's what that first line there means. On the part of the cognitive power, counsel is required by which we judge one thing to be preferred to another. And on the part of the appetitive power, the will, it is required that the appetite should accept the counsel of judgment. So free will, which is choosing between option A and option B, will necessarily desire what reason has determined to be the fulfillment of the desire. Therefore, Aristotle, because he is referring to Aristotle in some of this context, therefore Aristotle leaves it in doubt whether choice belongs principally to the appetitive power or the cognitive power. All right. So, is choice primarily in the act of the will or an act of the judgment? All right, but he continues and says the reason of this is because the proper object of choice is the means to the end. So the act of judgment in the mind judges A to be a better fulfillment of my desire. And then the act of free will choose that object A. So it is judgment that puts forth object A as being the object that is better for me. So the reason of this is because the proper object of choice, option A, is the means to the ultimate end of happiness. And this, as such, is in the nature of that good which is called useful. Let's look at this more, right? Some important points. Cognition judges one thing to be preferred over another, right? So the second act of the mind over there on the left, under cognitive power, we have judgment, right, which combines terms into a proposition that makes a truth claim. The truth claim here is that one thing is to be preferred over another. And then he also says it is required that the appetite should accept the counsel of judgment. All right. So first of all, we have judgment making a claim that option A is to be preferred over option B. And then he says it is required that free will desire this counsel of judgment. The proper object of choice is the means to the end. So the judgment puts forth the object of choice. All right, as we talked about earlier, which one moves which, right? Does cognitive power move the appetitive power, or does the appetitive power move the cognitive power? We had arrows going both directions. That's because the appetitive power is the efficient cause that moves the thinking, but thinking is the final cause, right? Thinking provides the final cause, which moves the will. The final cause is the object of choice, the purpose in my choice, right? So this last quote here, the proper object of choice is the means to the end. So the judgment acts in judging one thing to be preferred over another, and that one thing, which is to be preferred, is the object that I choose, the object of choice, the final cause, the purpose the goal that I accomplish in choosing. All right, so in summary, the will must choose the option that cognition judges to be truly good as a means to the ultimate end. All right? So judgment comes first, and then free will must desire whatever judgment judges to be preferred. All right? So you think about this in a more common way in our personal experience. When we're thinking about a choice, we're thinking about which thing that we should choose. And once our thinking is complete, our thinking has judged, oh, this is better for me than that, right? So you're trying to judge whether to do homework or whether to go watch Netflix, all right? And so you think about deadlines, and you think about responsibilities, and you think about pleasure and need for recuperating and re-energizing. You compare these different things, and then finally you make a judgment. You say, well, right now I really need to fulfill my responsibilities, and this is to be preferred over the other. So that's the act of judgment, and then that's the thing that you choose. All right? If you chose something else, if you thought all of those things and then you chose Netflix, that's because you ended up judging, even though this is a responsibility of mine, I really just want to watch Netflix or something like that, right? So judgment of the mind precedes the free act of the will, and the will desire whatever the reason judges to be the case. This is called intellectual determinism. Choice is determined by something outside free will, namely something outside freedom, namely practical judgment, right? So judgment occurs before free will, and judgment is rather mechanical, all right? Because the processing in your mind is the functioning of processing information, and the information that you have is propositions about the world out there, right? It is things that you think about. The processing of your thoughts are determined by what you know in simple apprehension, which is the first act of the mind. But simple apprehension, we have little control over that. So, for example, if you know what a unicorn is, you cannot choose to just flip a switch and stop understanding what a unicorn is. You cannot force yourself to stop understanding what a unicorn is. You may grow in understanding what a unicorn is, just like you're growing in understanding through watching these videos, hopefully. When you understand, you simply do understand, right? If somebody turns a light on, you immediately understand that a light is on. And in your mind, you cannot force yourself to become confused, right? You can use reason to think about things in such a way where you can question your previous beliefs and confuse yourself in that way. But in terms of simple apprehension of the definitions of concepts, you either do or you do not understand them. And that is mechanical. We don't have control over that. And judgment is based off of that. So, for example, do you believe that unicorns exist? All right, your answer is probably no. You cannot force yourself to believe that unicorns exist. You can pretend that they exist. Another way of saying that is that the propositions formed in judgment are formed on the basis of understanding things. All right, so you either do or you do not understand that unicorns exist. All right, and if you believe that unicorns do not exist, you cannot just make a choice and switch that belief. All right, You have to become convinced first. You have to think that it's true in order to actually believe it. You cannot force yourself to believe something just by choosing it, right? So choice depends upon your thinking. You cannot force yourself to believe something. You have to actually believe that it's true. Of course, you can be deceived. You can learn something new. You can forget something. Something can happen in your thinking where your thinking changes and you now think that something is true, but your belief just necessarily follows from that, according to this model, right? Choice is determined by something outside free will, something outside freedom, namely practical judgment. Simple apprehension is mechanical. We simply do or do not understand concepts. Judgment is just as mechanical and subject to external causes. So is Aquinas a compatibilist or a libertarian? Well, let's investigate a little bit more about what those terms mean. What is the definition of freedom? There are three contested elements to the definition of what is freedom, right? One is contra-causal. This is to say that freedom means that I am the primary cause of my choices, contrary to any external influences. And then there's the principle of alternate possibilities, which is the main definition that Aquinas uses. He says that freedom is the ability to choose otherwise. And then greatest desire. So we might say that I follow my desire in choosing something, right? So libertarians all of them affirm some kind of contra-causality, and most of them prefer the PAP, the principle of alternate possibilities, right? But that's kind of optional, the middle one. Compatibilists are similar. All compatibilists affirm greatest desire, but not all of them claim PAP, right? So libertarians say the ability define freedom as the ability to choose contrary to influences or external causes, whereas compatibilism defines freedom as the ability to choose what you want. Right? This is to say that free will and determinism are compatible. That's where the word comes from. So causality and freedom are compatible. This is not the same as robots or animals because choice is from self-conscious desire. Right? This preserves moral responsibility. Again, that's the difference between fatalism and determinism. Fatalism says that freedom is not real. Determinism says that causation is intentional and works through our will, not despite it. Let's go back to our model, right, where judgment seems to be causing free will. But in another sense, perhaps intellectual appetitive power causes the cognitive power, right? Because Aquinas said the will as agent moves all the powers of the soul. But he also says the end moves the agent. The intellect moves the will in one sense, and the will moves the intellect in another, as we have said above. So do you see where the confusion lies in figuring out whether he is libertarian or compatibilist? Because if the will is primary, then he seems to be libertarian. But if the cognitive power is primary, then he seems to be compatibilist. Does the will cause itself, or is it the product of other causes? The major question here. We're going in both directions, it seems. Conclusion to that debate is that different people interpret Aquinas as either libertarian or compatibilist. Aquinas' biggest emphasis in defining freedom rests on the principle of alternate possibilities. And if you remember, that's the middle commonality where both compatibilists and libertarians can affirm or deny it. That provides some ambiguity to interpreting Aquinas as either libertarian or compatibilist. I would probably say that the majority prefer to interpret him in a libertarian vein for just wider philosophical reasons, but you judge one way or the other which one you think that Aquinas is. Aquinas on free will. Is there always a reason for every choice that you make, even if the reasons are non-conscious? That's important, all right? That's important. Reason does not mean that you're aware of the reason. It's just asking about cause and effect, right? If you flip a coin, you'd say you don't know if it's going to turn up heads or tails, but once it does land up heads, you will not know the reasons why it landed up heads, but will you expect that there are reasons that are non-conscious may have played in? So the question is about choice. Is there always a reason for every choice that you make, even if the reasons are non-conscious? Second, can you choose to do something completely outside of your personality? In what sense, yes, and in what sense, no? Maybe you want to say all yes and all no, right? Can you choose something completely outside of your personality? For example, can you choose to rob a bank right now, to go out and rob a bank? What's stopping you from choosing to do that? Or choosing to go steal something at the store, all right? Could you choose to do that? Like, is that really a possibility? Is that a realistic possibility that you could do that? If so, why? And if not, why? What's stopping you? All right? Let's investigate causality and rationality. How does reason interact with the will in a choice? If yes, then why did you choose that? Where does that reason come from? Next, what is your view on the relationship between causes and choices? All right? These are all to investigate the nature of the relationship between causality and choice in defining freedom.